When it comes to slicing meat, knowing what you're doing is the difference between having it be tough and impossible to chew and it being fall apart tender. A lot of that comes down to knowing what you're cutting and then knowing what to look for on that particular cut. So I'm going to walk you through some of our common grilling steaks, the kind you would make on a stovetop or in a pan, and show you how to cut them properly. Some of them are really easy. Starting with the filet. Filet has a little bit of a grain that goes in all directions. It's super tender. It really doesn't matter how you cut it. I can slice it into cubes. I can slice it into slices. I can slice it into half. It's going to be tender no matter what. So when it comes to a filet, cut it up, don't cut it up, cut it as you eat it. It doesn't matter. As you can see, there is a little bit of a grain, but that meat is so tender, it doesn't matter. Now, next up we have a ribeye. Certainly one of the most tender steaks you can have. Now, a ribeye has grains, again, going in all sorts of directions. With the ribeye, it doesn't matter where you slice it, but if you do see a grain, slicing against it will make it that much more tender. So we're looking here. You'll always see a grain running in a sort of a semicircle at the bottom of the ribeye. That is the most tender part of the ribeye, and again, if you slice against that, you're getting just that much more of a tender bite. And you can see very distinct grain running through the steak. Cutting against it, super tender. Cutting not against it, cutting along the grain, still going to be pretty tender because it's a really tender steak. That takes care of the ribeye. Next up, we have another very tender steak, the New York strip. Now, the New York strip has a very distinct grain running in one direction, but because it's such a tender steak coming from the short loin area of the animal, it's going to be pretty tender no matter which way you slice it. However, I prefer to slice it against the grain. What I like to do with a New York strip is take that strip of fat that makes it so distinctive along the edge and cut that right off. Because there tends to be a layer of silver skin underneath, and that's going to stay tough no matter what you do to it. So rather than having to bite through that, I put it aside. Now I will cut my steak in half. Now I've cut along the grain, and then I turn it, and now I can slice it against the grain. And again, even though it's such a super tender steak, slicing it against the grain is going to ensure that each bite is that much more chewable. All right, that's our New York strip. That kind of takes us out of the zone of the super tender grilling steaks. Now I have this awesome, relatively new steak known as the flat iron. Now, flat iron is cut from chuck, and that means it's a well-used muscle. It's not going to be automatically super tender. However, the flat iron is extracted from an area on the chuck that isn't often used. So it does have that distinctive grain and connective tissue, but it is more tender than a chuck roast, for example. However, that only happens if you cut against the grain. So with the flat iron, there is a distinct grain. If you cut with the grain, it's not going to be very tender. If you cut against the grain, it's going to melt in your mouth. And you can see a super distinct grain right there as I spread it apart. So you want to cut perpendicular to that. And every time you do that, super tender results. And you can see in each of these slices that distinct grain running through it. As long as you're cutting against that, it's going to be really tender. So that takes care of our flat iron. Next we have the bavette steak, which comes from underneath the animal towards the front. It's a very well-used muscle. And the benefit of that is it's incredibly flavorful, just packed with beefy flavor because it's concentrated. But it does mean it works hard and therefore has a very distinct grain. You have to cut against it or it'll basically be inedible. So we look for that grain before we start slicing. I have identified it's running that way, and now I'm going to cut it perpendicular to the grain. And as you can see, this bavette has even more of a distinct grain than the flat iron did. And it almost looks like what a brisket would look like because it's cut from the general area that the brisket comes from. Cutting it against the grain, super tender. All right. That basically covers our grilling steaks, the ones that you would make quickly on your stovetop, the quick cooking cuts. And now, as a bonus, the bone-in ribeye. If you haven't cut one of these before, it's real easy, same as cutting a regular ribeye, but take the bone off first. So I just insert the knife at the top where the bone is, slide it down along the bone, bone comes off, and then I like to start at the point, the top that was closest to the bone, and just slice it right there, all the way down. Once I get to the collar where the grain direction changes, I'll turn the steak as well. So here I am, right about where the collar is, and now I'll slice that against the grain. So there you have slicing beef, always against the grain. Not just beef, but you'll see grains in pork, you'll see grain in chicken. A chicken breast has a grain running through it. If you cut along the grain, it ends up being stringy. Cut against the grain, nice tender bites every time. Cut against the grain.